Hello guys. The Gospel of Matthew is often criticized for making up certain parts of Jesus' life in order to fulfill Old Testament prophecy. Two of these main stories are regarding the virgin birth narrative in Matthew 1:18-25 and Jesus' flight to Egypt narrative in Matthew 2, verse 13-15. Skeptics of the Bible often say that Matthew just made up these things in order to fulfill vague prophecies of the Old Testament. But when we look at history, do we find actually anything that could be related to a virgin birth or Jesus going down to Egypt when he was a boy? Do we find anything like that in history? Well, today we're going to be looking at a couple of historical documents and see what they have to say about these things, as well as other things about Jesus' early life. Now, two books we're going to be looking at are two hostile sources to Christianity. One of them by a 2nd century critic of Christianity named Celsus, and Celsus around the year 175 wrote a book called True Word. Now, unfortunately, Celsus' book True Word is no longer in existence. Emperor Valentinian and Emperor Theodosius, both in the 1st century, pushed a ban on Celsus' books, causing all of them to be destroyed. So we do not actually have any of Celsus' writings. What we do have, however, is writings of a Christian source named Origen Adamantius. Origen lived in the 3rd century, and he wrote a book called Against Celsus, where it was a rebuttal to many of Celsus' arguments against Christianity. Many things that Celsus said against Christianity were copied of Origen's criticism of Celsus. And so we've got a whole bunch of snippets of Celsus' work preserved in this book. Now, one quick disclaimer about Celsus' work. It is obvious that he is sourcing the Gospels themselves. He is criticizing what Christians believe, and so he's sourcing their books, particularly the book of Matthew. The other text we're going to be looking at is the Jewish Talmud. The Talmud is kind of like a second Bible in Jewish culture. It is a collection of texts written anywhere from like the 1st century all the way to the 6th century. The Talmud is very influential to Jewish culture ever since then, even to the modern day. And though it's not regarded in a sacred manner like the Tanakh or the Torah, it is heavily studied amongst Jewish communities today. Squeaky chair. I hope this isn't getting in the video too much. So let's get into some of these different arguments that Christians have upheld and see what these anti-sources say about these arguments. Beginning with the virgin birth narrative. Matthew chapter 1 verses 18-25 tells a story about Jesus being miraculously conceived into a virgin woman, and Matthew argues that this was to fulfill prophecy taken from Isaiah 7 verse 14 that says, "Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, a virgin will be with child and bear a son, and she will call his name Emmanuel," which means God with us. Many skeptics of Christianity say that Matthew made up this part, misunderstanding the prophecy of Isaiah's time, because really the context of Isaiah's prophecy is kind of weird to be talking about somebody 700 years later. But let's see what Celsus has to say about this passage. In Book 1 of Origen's Against Celsus, chapter 32, Origen records the following quote from Celsus. Celsus says, "When she, Mary, was pregnant, she was turned out of doors by the carpenter to whom she had been betrothed, as having been guilty of adultery, that she bore a child to a certain soldier named Pantera." Okay, so in Matthew, we've got this idea that Jesus' mother Mary conceived him while she was still a virgin, but Celsus was arguing that she was not a virgin, she just committed adultery while she was engaged to her husband. So this kind of has a little bit of a connection to it. But let's see what the Talmud says. Sanhedrin 67a, verse 14-15 says, "And they did the same to the insider named Ben-Seta from the city of Lod, and they hanged him on the Passover Eve." The Gemara asks, why did they call him Ben-Seta when he was the son of Pandiera? Rav Hista says, perhaps his mother's husband, who acted as his father, was Seta, but his mother's paramour, who fathered this Memzar, was named Pandiera. The Gemara challenges, but his mother's husband was Pappos ben Yehuda, not Seta. Rather, perhaps his mother was Seta, and he was named Ben-Seta after her. The Gemara challenged, but his mother was Miriam, who braided women's hair. The Gemara explains, this is not a contradiction. Sotah is merely a nickname, as they say in Pumbedita. This one strayed, Sotah, from her husband. Now, this passage doesn't mention Jesus, rather it mentions a person called Ben Sotah. Now, Ben is a Hebrew word for son, and is often used in front of a person's father's name. And that's why they're asking why he was called Ben Sotah when his father was not named Sotah. Rather, they're going on to explain that Sotah is actually a word that means one who strayed, or son of an adulterous woman, or son of another word. Okay, so this passage is not saying Jesus, but it is sometimes questioned of whether this passage is about Jesus or not. This is talking about a person who was hanged on the eve of Passover, which was when Jesus was crucified. His mother's name was Miriam, which is the Hebrew name for Mary. Notice the name of the acclaimed biological father for this Ben Sotah is Pandiera, which is a Hebrew equivalent to what Celsus said, that Jesus' father was a Roman soldier named Pantera. Accordingly, even Jewish literature into the Middle Ages talked about Jesus being the son of a Pantera or Pandiera, who through means of adultery with Mary or Miriam conceived Jesus. So a lot of Jews have considered this passage to be about Jesus. The main difference with this passage in Sanhedrin is that it says that Jesus was from the city of Lod. Now, the city of Lod is not the same city as Bethlehem, where the Gospels say that Jesus was born, nor is it the same city as Nazareth, where everyone agrees that Jesus is from. So the city of Lod is a contradiction. Also, this passage says that Jesus' earthly father was Paphos, not Joseph. So could this passage be talking about Jesus? It is debated. There's a lot of similarities, a couple of contradictions. Now, what I find interesting about these passages is not that Matthew made up this claim of Jesus' virgin birth, but rather that Jesus was actually conceived out of wedlock. That it wasn't that she was virgin, that was just a cover story. There's another passage from Celsus which goes deeper into this. Recorded in Against Celsus, Book 1, Chapter 28. It says, Jesus invented his birth from a virgin, born in a certain Jewish village, of a poor woman of the country who gained her subsistence by spinning, and who was turned out of doors by her husband, a carpenter by trade, because she was convicted of adultery, that after being driven away by her husband, and wandering for a time, she disgracefully gave birth to Jesus, an illegitimate child. So Celsus is not saying that Matthew made up the virgin birth narrative to fulfill prophecy. Rather, he's saying that Jesus made up the virgin birth narrative to cover the shame of his illegitimacy. To that we can ask an interesting question. Jesus' conception out of wedlock, a illegitimate child, is not something that's good for his claim. That was an extremely disgraceful thing in his culture, and also it caused him to grow up in poverty, according to Celsus. So his illegitimate conception was a very great misfortune for him. But this very unfortunate thing actually proved very beneficial to him because of this passage from Isaiah written about 700 years prior, that a virgin will conceive and bear a son, and call his name to mean God is with us. So what should have been a disgrace and something to completely discredit Jesus' reputation actually became something that was beneficial to promote his deity claims. In a twist of irony, it's fortunate that he was an illegitimate child so that he could claim this prophecy. It's also fortunate that there was this prophecy, whether it's taken out of context or not. It's fortunate that there was this prophecy for him to take out of context to support this claim. These things should have gone against him, actually ended up working in his favor, and that is an interesting twist of irony. Or you might say it's a coincidence. Now, the second passage of Celsus I'm actually not finished reading, because it goes on. After it describes Mary giving birth to Jesus, it then goes on to describe what happened after his birth. She disgracefully gave birth to Jesus, an illegitimate child, who, having hired himself out as a servant in Egypt on account of his poverty, and having there acquired some miraculous powers, on which the Egyptians greatly pride themselves, returned to his own country, highly elated on account of them, and by means of these proclaimed himself a god. So the next thing we're looking at is a flight to Egypt. Matthew 2:13-15 says that Jesus had to flee to Egypt because Herod was out to kill him. This is another thing that skeptics say that Matthew made up in order to fulfill a vague prophecy from Hosea chapter 11 verse 1, which reads, "Out of Egypt I have called my son." Now, skeptics will rightfully point out that using this verse is kind of taking something out of context, because that is not the entire verse. That is the entire text that Matthew cites, but it's not the entire text in what Hosea actually wrote. The entire verse in Hosea says, "When Israel was a youth, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son." That beginning part of the verse is completely omitted in the book of Matthew. Then again, chapters and verse numbers weren't really written in the time of Matthew, so it's not really fair to say he omitted some of the verse, because technically we could say he omitted most of the book of Hosea. Still, we could say, out of context, he drew this passage. But now we do see how Celsus did criticize the flight to Egypt, not saying that Jesus never went to Egypt, but rather saying it was because of his poverty that he went to Egypt and needed to sell himself out as a slave. Let's see what the Talmud says about this. In Sanhedrin 107b, verses 12 through 14, it tells a story. Now, real quick, in this Talmud passage, I'm actually going to be reading the name of Jesus as Yesu. The Jewish name for Jesus is Yeshua. However, most Jews who do not believe in Yeshua will actually call him Yesu. It's kind of a censorship term to avoid saying his actual name, and is theorized to be an acronym in Hebrew for "May his name and memory be blotted out." It is unclear in the time that the Talmud was written whether Jesus was the only Yesu that they talked about or not. So whenever the Talmud says Yesu, it could translate Jesus of Nazareth, or it could translate to somebody else entirely who just fell off of history. Most scholars think it does have some kind of connection to Jesus, though. Some ancient Talmud manuscripts have the name crossed out, some have the name Yesu, some have Jesus of Nazareth, some have the entire story omitted entirely. I have not done an in-depth study on what the original manuscripts or what the earliest manuscripts said, though. So with that knowledge, let's look at this passage from Sanhedrin 107b, verses 12 through 14. What is the incident of Yehoshua ben Paera? The Gemara relates, when King Yanai was killing the sages, Yehoshua ben Paera and Yesu, his student, went to Alexandria of Egypt. When there was peace between King Yanai and the sages, Shimon ben Sotah sent a message to Yehoshua ben Paera, "From me, Jerusalem, the holy city, to you, Alexandria of Egypt. My sister, my husband, is located among you, and I sit desolate. The head of the sages of Israel is out of the country, and Jerusalem requires his return." Yehoshua ben Paera understood the message, arose, came, and happened to arrive at a certain inn on the way to Jerusalem. They treated him with great honor. Yehoshua ben Paera said, "How beautiful is this inn!" Yesu, his student, said to him, "But my teacher, the eyes of the innkeeper's wife are narrow." Yehoshua ben Paera said to him, "Wicked one, do you involve yourself with regard to that matter, the appearance of a married woman?" He produced 400 shafot. Yesu came before Yehoshua ben Paera several times and said to him, "Accept my repentance." Yehoshua ben Paera took no notice of him. One day Yehoshua ben Paera was reciting the Shema, and Yesu came before him with the same request. Yehoshua ben Paera intended to accept his request and signaled him with his hand to wait until he had completed the prayer. Yesu did not understand the signal and thought, "He is driving me away." He went and stood a brick upright to serve as an idol, and he bowed to it. Yehoshua ben Paera then said to Yesu, "Repent." Yesu said to him, "This is the tradition I received from you. Whoever sins and causes the masses who sin is not given opportunity to repent." And the Master says, Yesu performed sorcery, incited the Jews to engage in idolatry, and led Israel astray. So the story is telling a time when this king Yanai is persecuting the sages, and this one particular sage named Yehoshua ben Paera flees to Egypt with his servant Yesu, which might be Jesus. It is then on the way back that Jesus falls into sin of idolatry and sorcery. If you're like me, you might be thinking, now this actually sounds exactly like what hostile sources to Christianity would say, given the story that we have in Matthew. Whereas in Matthew says that King Herod, right, a king, wanted to kill Jesus, therefore Jesus had to flee to Egypt, and then when there was peace, Jesus came back to Israel. Now those two stories sound very similar to each other, don't they? Now again, there are some interesting differences. We do not know much about this person, Yehoshua ben Pyrrha, nor do we really know much about King Yanai, but they did both live before King Herod. In fact, they predate Jesus about 100 years. So if this story was really about Jesus, then it's 100 years before Jesus was even born. Now, of course, many similarities, but it's too early. So what happened? Is this just talking about somebody else entirely, but because they used the name Yesu to censor his name like they do with Jesus, that it just got confused as Jesus? Possible. That is kind of considered one of the main arguments. Another argument would be that the Jews got this confused. They were familiar with the Matthew story, were not familiar with Herod killing the babies, and therefore got confused with the King Yanai killing the sages, and then kind of filled in the story with that, and then kind of made up the parts about Jesus falling to sin. A third theory is that the writers of the Talmud did this on purpose to discredit Christianity. A fourth theory that Jesus mythicists say is that Jesus was actually based off of this Yesu who came 100 years before him, so that the myth of Jesus actually had a forerunner 100 years prior to his birth, or his alleged birth. Now, given the vast amount of sources we have of Jesus in history in this last video, I'm going to say that fourth theory is highly unlikely. Oh, and by the way, this story from the Talmud is also repeated in another passage in the Talmud, in the book of Sotah 47a, 12 through 14. So what we do have is we've got 3 different stories about Jesus in Egypt. The Gospels say that Jesus fled to Egypt because King Herod was trying to kill him. The Talmud says that Jesus fled to Egypt because King Yanai was trying to kill him. And Celsus says that Jesus fled to Egypt because of his poverty from being born in an illegitimate conception. All 3 stories have a narrative of Jesus going down to Egypt. Like the virgin birth, it doesn't seem like Matthew just made up this story out of thin air. It seems like there was a historical story there to be spun, if nothing else. Now, this unfortunate thing of Jesus having to go down to Egypt, rather because of his poverty or trying to escape the onslaught of a king, this is an unfortunate circumstance in Jesus' life, but an unfortunate circumstance that turned out for his favor because of this passage in Hosea about God calling his son out of Egypt. And this unfortunate circumstance, in a twist of irony, proved beneficial to Jesus' messianic claim. Again. Now, what are the odds of one of these misfortunes happening, coinciding with one of these prophecies being in the Old Testament, coinciding with this opportunity to synthesize these things to promote somebody's claim of messiahship because of unfortunate circumstances? In one of those stories, all of those things falling into place is rather unlikely, not super unlikely, but is a little unlikely. But for both of these things, it's kind of becoming more unlikely at that point. Now, Celsus does have another quote about Jesus in Egypt, and this one is more of scoffery. He's not affirming Matthew's history, he's making fun of it in this passage. In Against Celsus, Book 1, Chapter 66, Origen records this quote: "What need, moreover, was there for you, while still an infant, should be conveyed to Egypt? Was it to escape being murdered? But then it was not likely that a god should be afraid of death, and yet an angel came from heaven, commanding you and your friends to flee, lest you should be captured and put to death. And was not the great God who had already sent 2 angels on your account able to keep you, his only son, there in safety?" Now, this is scoffery. He's making fun of Christianity. Why would Jesus need to go down to Egypt if he was the Son of God? And if God had access to all these angels who could do some incredibly powerful things, why did God need to send him down to Egypt to hide? He could have just protected him there in Israel. This passage should not, however, be considered, well, there we have it, more evidence that Jesus did flee from King Herod. No, Celsus is obviously referencing the book of Matthew. This is not extra attestation. He's sourcing the book of Matthew to make fun of the book of Matthew. This passage does not add any credibility to it. In a similar way, Celsus also references the Magi visiting Jesus at his young age. Origen recounts this quote in Against Celsus, Book 1, Chapter 58. "The Chaldeans are spoken of by Jesus as having been introduced to come to him at his birth, and to worship him while he was yet an infant as a god, and to have made this known to Herod the Tetrarch, and that the latter sent and slew all the infants that had been born about the same time, thinking that in this way he would ensure his death among the others, and that he was led to do this through fear that, if Jesus lived to a sufficient age, he would obtain the throne. Now, again, this is not extra biblical source. This is, again, Celsus just referencing Matthew. Now, let's look at a few more passages from the Talmud and from Celsus that talk about Jesus' followers. Because, by the way, these passages do not speak well of them. In Against Celsus, Book 1, Chapter 62, Origen recounts this quote from Celsus. Jesus, having gathered around him 10 or 11 persons of notorious character, the very wickedest of tax collectors and sailors, fled in company with them from place to place, and obtained his living in a shameful and importune way. So here Celsus is just calling Jesus' followers as disgraceful people, but it is interesting that he says a couple of their occupations, tax collector and sailor. This is interesting because Matthew was claimed to be a tax collector, and many of Jesus' other followers were said to be fishermen, most notably Simon Peter, but also James and John, the sons of Zebedee. In the Talmud, there's a passage from Avodah Zarah 17a 1-2, and here it talks about some of the followers, again, of this Yesu. Now, the passage is going to be on the screen, but I'm not going to read it because it's not exactly the cleanest of passages. But basically, he says that Jesus taught his followers that they can use improperly acquired money to pay their tithe to the temple. Now, later in the book of Avodah Zarah, in 27b-6, it talks about one of Jesus' followers attempting to perform a miracle, but he was withheld from doing so. It says, the Baraita relates an incident illustrating this point. There was an incident involving Ben Dama, son of Rabbi Ishmael's sister, in which a snake bit him. And following the attack, Yaakov of the village of Shachania, who was a heretic, a disciple of Yesu, came to treat him, but Rabbi Ishmael did not let him do so. And Ben Dama said to him, Rabbi Ishmael, my brother, let him treat me, and I will be healed by him. And I will cite a verse of the Torah to prove that accepting medical treatment from a heretic is permitted in this situation. But Ben Dama did not manage to complete the statement before his soul departed from his body, and he died. I think this passage is interesting because there's this follower of Yesu named Yaakov who came to heal this rabbi's nephew. And the passage almost implies that Yaakov would have been able to have healed him if Rabbi Ishmael would have allowed him to. But because he was a heretic following Yesu, he did not allow him into his house to heal his nephew, and thus his nephew died. So these are some interesting sources we have on the life of Jesus from some rather hostile sources. In part 3, I'll be going over some various sources regarding Jesus' execution because there's some actually interesting stuff regarding that in the non-Christian sources. I think from what we gather from the beginning regarding Jesus' virgin birth and his flight to Egypt, we got some interesting things. Our modern critics say that Matthew made these things up to fulfill Old Testament prophecies, but critics of the time weren't saying that. They were saying that there was a story there, they just tried to give a different interpretation of the story. The virgin birth, they didn't say that Matthew made that up to fulfill Isaiah 7. They said that Jesus made it up to cover the shame of being illegitimately conceived. So there was a story there. Similarly, the flight to Egypt, modern skeptics say that Matthew made it up to fulfill Hosea's prophecy. But the ancient world did not say that Matthew made it up. They said that there was other reasons why Jesus fled to Egypt. So there seems to be a story there. It is important to note that ancient writers probably had access to sources we do not have today. So these stories of this Pantera, the father of Jesus, or the stories of Jesus going down to Egypt were probably more solidified back in the ancient world. So I think it seems to me that Matthew did not make these up. These were circulating stories for one reason or another, probably because there was a history there. The thing I find interesting about this is all the misfortunes. Jesus was conceived illegitimately, very unfortunate thing for him. But because of that, the irony is that it turned into his favor because there happened to be a passage like Isaiah 7:14. He grew up in poverty, so he had to flee to Egypt. Another unfortunate thing to him, which in a twist of irony proved fortunate because of Hosea 11:1, and many other twists of irony in his life. If what Celsus said was true, that Jesus acquired magic powers while down in Egypt, then another thing, because of the unfortunate circumstances of his enslavement, actually proving beneficial to his messiahship claim, because without the miracles, he wouldn't have had much claim towards deity. And this is but the tip of the iceberg when we get into his crucifixion. You do not get more unfortunate than dying by Roman crucifixion. And yet, in the bleakest and most hopeless of all situations, that was the inciting incident that led to the rise of the church and Christianity. Without the cross, you do not have Christianity. So it seems like Jesus' entire life is filled with unfortunate circumstances which actually get reversed and turned around for his favor, in a way that without these unfortunate circumstances, there would be a lot of unfulfilled prophecy, or less prophecy taken out of context to point towards his messiahship. It's as Isaiah says, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And yet, because of all the sorrows and all these griefs, made him the single most influential figure in all of human history, historical or figurative. No one in any genre of literature has been nearly as significant in the turn of history as Jesus of Nazareth. My favorite chapter that Origen wrote in Against Celsus is in Book 1, Chapter 29. In it, he draws reference to a story in the writings of Plato regarding a Seriphian, and the Seriphian argues with this person called Themistocles. And Themistocles, Origen says, after he had become celebrated for his military skills, saying that his reputation was due not to his own merit, but to his good fortune in having been born in the most illustrious country in Greece, received by the good-natured Athenians who saw that his native country did contribute to his renown, the following reply: neither would I, had I not been a Seriphian, have been so distinguished as I am, nor would you have been a Themistocles, even if you had had the good fortune of being an Athenian. So Origen is saying, from this work of Plato, that these two figures, this Seriphian and this Themistocles, were great people because of where they were born, because of the rich family that they were born into, because of the good circumstances that they had, because of the training they had, the most illustrious city in the entire empire of Greece. It's because of that proper upbringing, that good training, that rich family, that superiority of being in the most advanced civilization of their time that paved the way for all their success. Origen contrasts this with Jesus. And now our Jesus, who is reproached with being born in a village that not of a Greek one, nor belonging to any nation widely esteemed, and being despised as the son of a poor laboring woman, and having, on account of his poverty, left his native country and hired out in Egypt, and being, to use the instance already quoted, not only a Seriphian, as it were, a native of a very small and undistinguished island, but even so to speak, the meanest of all Seriphians, has yet been able to shake the whole inhabited world, not only to a degree far above what Themistocles the Athenian never did, but beyond that of Pythagoras or Plato or any other wise man of any part of the world wherever, or any prince or general ever succeeded in doing. And what he's saying, these two characters, this Seriphian and this Themistocles, two renowned figures in their time. By the way, I have never heard of either one of these before studying this passage, but two very renowned figures of their time. Yet they did not achieve the great stature which Jesus achieved. They were born into illustrious cities, rich families, trained by the best people of their time. Jesus, born of a poor woman in the backwater country, in a small town of that backwater country, fled into another country to work as a slave, no masters, no training of any kind in his upbringing. And yet, not only did Jesus surpass the Seriphian and the Themistocles in greatness and in stature, but he even surpassed Plato and Pythagoras and every other prince in general of any other category. If the Seriphian and the Themistocles were great because of their upbringing, then their greatness was not contributed to their own character, but to their own upbringing. In contrast, Jesus rose not because of his upbringing, but in spite of his upbringing. Everything that was set against him turned out for his favor in the most ironic way. But it wasn't enough just to surpass the Seriphian and the Themistocles, but Jesus surpassed everyone. All the pharaohs of Egypt, all the kings of Babylon, all the emperors and Caesars of Rome, all figures of all human history, yet none has had the status, yet none has had the reputation, yet none has had the worldwide claim to fame like this poor, homeless, illegitimate child, slave of a poor peasant woman in a backwater country, Jesus of Nazareth. Origen marvels at this, and I think it's good reason to. On the one hand, you can say Jesus was the most unfortunate person in all human history. And yet, on the other hand, he has achieved more than anyone else in all human history. So is there any reason to think that Matthew is just making up random parts of Jesus' life to fulfill Old Testament prophecy and support claims that he was the Messiah? Nope, we actually have evidence that some of these things had a backstory to them. Whether Matthew got the story right or not, there was some kind of story there, but there is some interesting twist of irony to accept stories other than divine influence in the stories. So anyway guys, thanks for watching, and keep the faith.